everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 2 of the 2026 Spring Miniskein mini-series. Tonight, I am inspired to create a set of 5 distinct colorways, inspired by a single colorway I used for a recent episode of my Die Pot PS series. I had this sunrise on the marsh inspiration photo, created this watercolory backdrop, and then added color on top to sort of bring that marsh to life. And I was obsessed with that first layer of color and then that final colorway and thought, all right, let's create a set with that watercolor base and that other colorway with 3 other colors in between, and then see where we go and where we end up. Sort of letting the colors I build on that more pastel base sort of build and build and build as we go forward. Now we will be playing around with many different yarn bases for this set I want to create today. Let's go take a look. I'm going to use 7 different yarn bases for this project. We have a superwash merino and our 75-25 superwash merino nylon yarns. We have 2 sparkles, one with silver stellina, one with the mermaid. And it's very subtle in this light, but actually where I am today, you can see some of the sparkle and the difference between the mermaid and the silver. And then finally, we have a silk blend and a yak blend. Now, of all the yarns here, the ones that are likely to feel a bit different in the end are obviously the yak, because that's a standout right now, but then also the silk. In general, silk requires more dye to feel as vibrant as wool or wool nylon blends. Now, we happen to be dyeing everything in the same pot. And so in these comparisons, it's not necessarily that the other yarns absorb dye faster. This diamond stock absorbs dye really, really quickly. But because it absorbs a similar amount of color, and the silk content needs more pigment to have the same color in the end, therefore it's going to feel a bit less saturated than the other yarns will. But anyway, I'm going to go separate the yarn into bundles, and I'm going to go ahead and pre-soak the yarn in plain tap water for at least an hour, I think, probably a couple of hours. And I'm going to make sure there's no acid beyond the acidity that's inherently in my tap water. I'm going to be using that inspiration photo as the jumping off point, the point of where I pull the color palette. But I will be making some changes. I think I'll bring a little bit more of the purple in as well. Just a hint, and I think last time I didn't use any forest green, I might bring some of that in. We'll see how everything goes. But now I'm going to put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. And with a spoon, take out a little bit of our Valentine blush, lilac, baby blue eyes, and alpine blue dyes, dissolving it in hot tap water. I'm not measuring here because we will be diluting the dyes as we layer it onto the yarn to create a base color for 4 out of the 5 minis that we will eventually be dyeing. The 5th set, I don't think we'll need any of the pastel underneath it because we're going to dye that a saturated color. The other 4 sets, and so that would be 800 grams of yarn. I plan to dye all at the same time so we can have some consistency with this base color before we layer other things on top. And if I had the pan space, I could have done the 5th and then covered that up, but I don't think that it's necessary. One of the things I'm planning to do today is to start with the same base variegated level for most of our colorways. So I want to start off by dyeing yarn for 4 of the 5 sets all together. I'm going to use 2 of my catering steam pans with 400 grams of yarn in each pan. The yarn is still pretty darn wet. Now I could have wrung it out even more, but the reason why I didn't is because I want to be able to like move the dyes through a little bit. We might squish them through, we might not, but the last time I did this, the dyes sort of struck pretty quickly. So I am feeling optimistic that this will work. I'm just sort of aligning it. We will be moving the yarn a lot. Now, one difference between dyeing mini skeins versus full skeins of yarn is that it is possible for the same mini to get stuck on the bottom multiple times in a row. So we'll want to pay attention to that. For example, if you look at the yak here, we're very much on the surface. Here, part of it is buried. Here, it's a little bit of each. And of all of them, the yak is the one I want to pay attention to because since it's the darkest already, we are the most likely to have that color it'd be really hard to see how much color we have on there total. All right, let's start with one of the blues. Maybe editing Rebecca can look and see what I used for the green spoon. That feels like I put in a lot of dye, but you know what? We're rolling with it. I should go more dilute as we go forward, but we're treating everything the same. Now, as we go on, you know, there may be times where it's not going to be identical. I'm going to add just a little bit. I did mix these up stronger than what I did last time. We may not have perfectly the same amount of dye on each one. Like this time, you can see I'm going in and I'm doing sort of a very random distribution before getting more water and more of our dye. I have a feeling that this is the Baby Blue Eyes. The Baby Blue Eyes and Alpine Blue are so similar that it can be really hard to tell the difference. And we can add that over there. We will be getting more and more random as we move forward. Okay, I'm only gonna want a little bit of our lilac, I think. And with this color, I definitely pulled less of the powder than I had for some of the others. And you can see that as I'm adding it on, it is very, very pinkish when it is pastel. So even though it is a little bit purple, it will be bringing in some more pinks. Now, one issue I had the first time I was going deliberately for the marsh photo was that, and okay, I am gonna go, I'm mimicking the placement right now. I may not be doing that all the way into the end. But one thing I am hoping for is for the colors to overall be more pigmented than what I did for the base layer the first time. Because I feel like especially the pink, you know, which some went on, especially the pink disappeared a little bit. And so I want it to feel a little bit more present. Cool. Ah! And we can always go softer as we move forward, but we're really, really going by feel and totally spilling. Okay, and so then we can bring this over here and, you know, we'll continue. It'll be okay if there's some white left behind. Clearly, between the two pans, this pan has less pink than this one. And so things may not be 100% equal, but what I can try to do is when I pull the ones that I'm just gonna steam set, because this will be the first colorway, I could pick two from here if it's less pigmented than over here, or do something similar to that. What I am going to try to do is very intentionally pick the colors for each of the sets. Even though like these are two different sets, I'm going to try to pick each color from the same pan just for comparison. And I'm just building up this pink a little bit more. All right, now we have our last blue, which I'm going to do very, very softly. So I don't think I've used this blue yet, and I think this one is a little bit brighter. And just kind of coming in on some of the areas that are a little bit more white. But again, it's okay if some whites are left behind. I'm going to try to do a very similar amount. before coming over to this pan. And you know, again, it might be more dye. It is what it is. I'm not that worried or fussed. And then at this stage, I am going to come in and work things through a little bit. Now, interestingly, I am seeing pigment raise up. Whereas last time I did see things start to strike really quickly, sort of at this stage. So we'll keep an eye on that. But if like some of the blue does spread all over, again, it's totally fine. I'm not really gonna wait. I'm gonna flip the yarn, and I'm trying when I flip to not let the minis like shift relative to one another. Now we do already have good coverage here on the bottom. It helps that the circumference of the minis is shorter, so things don't need to be scrunched up that much in the pan. But the more water we have, the more likely colors are to spread out even more, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If we end up with something very lavender overall, I won't mind. But we are gonna carry on layering color, moving things around until I'm satisfied with the coverage. The goal is to dilute the dyes as I add them. This allows me to spread the colors out, because I don't know if you picked up on when I had a drop of the more concentrated color fall on the yarn, I couldn't work it through and spread it very far. If I was trying this technique right here with straight dye powder, I would be able to spread the colors a little bit more from where they've been placed, but we also then would end up with some deeper colors overall, because at some point as the dyes dissolve, there's a limit to how much you can spread it. But I am completely obsessed with this technique, and I do feel like we're getting really good coverage that I'm really, really happy with. I noticed when I was working on the first side that the colors were moving around and not necessarily hitting the yarn that fast. So I went ahead and added 3 tablespoons of white vinegar to each pan, and I decided to let the yarn rest a couple of minutes before flipping it to continue adding color onto the yarn. I just added a tiny bit more pink, but I think we are pretty good. I think the last thing I'm going to do is add a little bit more acid, and then, goodness, I think I am going, I wasn't sure how much pink would be moving around. Okay, I think I'm gonna take 2, did I move this one yet? Probably not. I'm gonna take 2 of our skeins, and we're gonna go and steam set this for 30 minutes. And the rest of the yarn we're actually going to combine in here. It's okay if things transfer, that's not a problem. I'm gonna add, the liquid is a little bit pink. Ooh, everything's gonna be very floaty now. This is fine, I'm gonna let it sit. I'm actually gonna set it aside. And we're gonna go wash out this pan, so that way we can dye some sock blanks and think about the colorway and the progression that I want to create. When thinking about the 5 colorways I want to create, I know what colorway 1 will be and then what colorway 3 or 4 will be. But what am I going to do for everything else? I think I want something light speckled, I want something very saturated, and then one more maybe resist dyed or something like that. But I realized I can play around with the colors I want to use and this color progression on a sock blank, and then use whatever I end up deciding to do on that blank to kind of help me determine what colors and what kind of placement I want to use on our different yarns. I'm dyeing up 2 double-stranded sock blanks, and I want to start with an all-over watercolory feel using the 4 colors, just like I had done on our other yarn. And then I'm going to use this as an opportunity to play around with the colors a little bit. Starting at the end, that'll eventually be the darkest, I added on some antique mauve and forest green speckles just to see how they're popping against it, because maybe for Skein 2, I might do just antique mauve speckles, but maybe I'll bring some forest green in. And then I took mostly the moss green, working it through, letting it get more and more concentrated towards the bottom, and brought in the other deep colors. And of course, while dealing with dry dye powder, I was wearing my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. I did add acid to the blank before I brought over any powders. I think I forgot to say that. The overall goal here was for me to try to figure out and finalize how I might want to order these colors. I know the overall techniques I want to do for colors 2 through 4, but I want to figure out what hues I want where, and this is going to help me do that. Now that I've added in all of the color, I am going to carefully add a little bit of water. This is water that has a couple tablespoons of white vinegar in it. So we can heat this for 30 minutes. And I'll continue to add more water as needed. The one big change I did is instead of having like a big moment of olive brown, I brought in that forest green instead. And let the olive brown just be sort of like an accent in a bit of the middle. So I think that I am liking where we're headed, and in this area here, there should still be some of the background left, whereas less over here. So that's the plan. Now we just gotta execute it. The nice thing about all of this is that Colorway 1 is done. So I am going to carefully set this yarn aside. Try not to touch it in case there's any residual dye on my gloves. And so this is to cool, and we are ready to start with Colorway 2. For our second colorway, I added 200 grams of our dyed yarn into my steam pan with 8 cups of water and 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. And I promptly realized this is more water than I want, because I want to be able to get some sharper, not the sharpest, but I don't want like huge chunky speckles on here. I'm going to want some of the yarn to be at the surface. So I removed almost half of the water. And then with my protective gear on, I brought over solely the antique mauve dye, speckling it onto the yarn in a few places. This is only going to be a really subtle shift from the last colorway, but I wanted to have enough of the mauve on here so that way it would give things a bit of a punch. I waited at least 5 minutes between flipping the yarn, so that way the colors wouldn't spread too much. And once I was satisfied with the color coverage, I let things heat for 30 minutes before removing the yarn and setting it aside. Colorway 3 is the most like the marsh system that I created in Dye Pot PS96. I came in with the moss green and had it be large blobs on our yarn. And then use a little bit of olive brown to sort of edge out the green with antique mauve speckles, sort of also close to those green clusters. I'm using the same dye bath that I used for the last one, and I added the rest of that liquid back in, and we'll add more water and vinegar as needed. I waited before flipping the yarn to dye the other side, and then let everything heat for 30 minutes once I was satisfied with the color coverage. You can see a little bit of the yarn mop that I created while working on this colorway with the dye that was on my gloves. I popped that into the pan and also let that heat for 30 minutes. For colorway 4, I wanted to create a bit of a resist to preserve some of our watercolor base layer. And to achieve this, I took each mini skein and tied 2 knots in it. These are thick enough that it should be easy to unravel those knots in the end, but I don't know, this whole thing tickled me a little bit and really amused me. I popped the skeins into a catering steam pan and then took a little bit of forest green, moss green, and antique mauve and dissolved the dyes in some water. I plan to add dye powders onto this as well, so that way the overall color placement isn't too smooth, but I wanted to get some coverage over the exposed yarn before we started to heat things up and apply some of the dye powders onto the exposed areas as well. The goal isn't necessarily for something speckled, but I don't want the colors to be too smooth because I want it to go with the more splotch harshness of what we have here already. You'll note that throughout this video, I am not measuring my colors very much. I am doing all of this by feel, using my gut, and I know we're gonna end up with something really, really pretty. There are times when it could be beneficial to measure out the amount of dyes that you're adding, but that's not something that I needed to do here today. Once my knotted yarn had cooled, and by the way, I am obsessed with the coloration we have on here, but once it cooled, I untied the knots that I had in there to reveal, hopefully, the resist that we had beneath. Now, this is a technique that would be a lot harder to do on a full skein. Because a full skein is so thick, the knot that I would tie in it, which I've done that before, that would be thick as well. And so you could do it with connected Miniskein with a super long hank, or, you know, use it and dye a bunch of Miniskeins in the same colorway that you could use all within one project if you love this result. But it would probably be easier to zip tie off smaller portions of a long skein, or to use thread or something. Then I don't know. There's options out there. Colorway 5 was a completely blank slate because I did not have any of our watercolor design on here yet. And so I used some of the dissolved forest green and antique mauve I had, dissolving more as needed, to start getting a background coverage on my countertop on our yarn. So that way when I go in, when it's hot with dry powders later, we will not have a lot of pastel uninterrupted areas left. And while still on the counter, I did bring in some powders and work it through because I didn't want to increase the water volume too much more. I did not keep track of how much vinegar I added at this stage, but I knew that there was enough. There were multiple tablespoons of vinegar in there, so I brought it over to the stove to start heating it. And then at the stove, I brought in more forest green and antique mauve, working it through, but I also decided to bring over some of the olive brown, a color which I also added on the previous stage just for some contrast and to add a little bit more dimension to it, so that way everything would, I don't know, connect and feel cohesive. And I really liked where it ended up. And of course, once again, I let everything heat for 30 minutes from the last time I added dye. When you're only dyeing 200 grams of yarn in a pan, it is pretty easy to get coverage. When you have 300, 400, or 500 grams of yarn, then you have to flip and rotate things more often. Towards the end of this last colorway, I had one little regret, and that is that I did not start with that underlayer of the blues and the pinks, because I know that this is mostly covered, but we don't have any of that peeking through. So I did go and take some dilute blue and sort of splashed, and some of the lilac too, I think, and I splashed it over some of the light areas just to tie it in a little bit more with everything else. At this final stage, it really didn't matter that I'm increasing the volume of water here a lot, because I am, you know, satisfied with the rest of the colorway. I started washing the most saturated yarn first, and I think that's the only ones I'm going to show on camera. There was a little bit of some bleeding, but it resolved quickly. Phew. So I took the yarn out of the water once I rinsed out all of the dish soap. I popped it in my spin dryer to just remove some of the liquid. It helps it air dry a lot faster, and then hung up the yarn to dry. Here is our finished yarn, and I am so happy. I think that maybe like our transition from here to here could be a little bit bolder. And you know, I could have brought some of the greens in, but I don't care because I like it. I love just the way that the colors come through, and I especially love I'll show closer in a minute, but down at the deepest one that I added some of those blues on top because you can see some of those blue notes shining in under the other colors. And I think it makes it feel more related to everything else that we have. Whereas just over white, it was going to feel a little bit stark. Now with this project, we started with a sock blank to plan things out. And it's a little bit different. Actually, things are lining up pretty well. One of the big differences is that I did bring some of the forest green down here more, and I increased the antique mauve more as we went over there, sort of thinking about it after doing this set. Don't get me wrong, I adore how this turned out. I think, gosh, because I did bring some of the forest green down this way, but you don't feel it that much. I love the way that these color combinations, I love the earthiness, and I'm really, really happy. Now we do also have a second blank. Oh my, this one has a lot more of the antique mauve down there. That's the thing with having two skeins in a pan. And sometimes things can turn out quite different, but also I think it's really, really fun. Now I am going to go ahead and unravel one of these blanks. And so let's take a closer look at it unraveled and talk about how a Miniskein set compares to the sock blank. This particular blank is quite asymmetric. You can see that we have a color progression and that we're adding colors in at different points, whether it's a little bit of speckles or a lot more color over the entire base color that we have here. Now with the double-stranded blank, it doesn't matter if I have a heavy speckle of antique mauve. That's going to happen on the same spot in both of our skeins of yarn because these blanks are going to unravel into two 50-gram balls of yarn. And yes, you could create something similar by knitting 2 at a time socks with the Miniskeins, knitting from both ends. And while you could get something that is very well matched and coordinated, they're going to be more coordinated than matched because if there is one big splotch of a color, that may show up in one and not the other. Now with an unraveled blank, your color progression is sort of predetermined. You don't need to weave in any ends, but if you're not using the entire blank on a project, then you may not have some of either the lightest color or the deepest color, depending on which end you start with. If you're using Miniskeins and you know how many rows are in a sock that you want to use, for example, you can plan where you want those color transitions to take place, so that way you can utilize all 5 colors in sort of more equal proportions. Ultimately, it comes down to personal preference though. If we're looking at just one, well, we have 2 sets here. We have 200 grams of yarn on the screen. You can really feel that progression a little bit more. And by having each mini sort of divided into thirds versus having it just straight, you can kind of get a sense of how these colors might blend. You can get a reasonable feel with things twisted up, but when it's twisted, you know, the different sections are shorter, and so sometimes I like to lay it out the other way too. But let's go twist everything up. The colors are more muted on our yak blend than they are on the platinum sock, but I'm so happy that we still see that pink and blue variation in our most pastel color. It is definitely more subtle than it is with a white base, but that variation is still present. A lot of our twisted sets feel very similar. I already talked about our yak, but the silk blends are a hair less saturated than the rest of the yarn, which is consistent with what we see with this base. In general, for silk to feel, or a silk blend to feel as pigmented as other yarn bases, you will need more dye overall. As we take close-ups at a few more of the yarn bases, you may note that I did not pick any of our more wild yarn bases for this particular colorway. Most notably, our yarn with the neon neps or our yarn with the zebra base. And that is because when you're doing a colorway with a lot of speckles, it doesn't necessarily show up as well on a base that has speckles in it in the form of neps, or that has that variation in it with the zebra. Now, this could look really cool on both of those bases, even though you might not think a neon color might go with this palette. Well, I still think it would be very pretty. It's just, you would see some of those neon neps first versus some of the more subtle color transitions we have here. And so it is worth considering sometimes if you have a yarn base that's more wild, when you may or may not want a colorway to go on that base. And I'm just bringing those ones up because those were two of the options for the 2026 Spring Miniskein mini-series. When you're dyeing a set of minis like this, you don't have to do different techniques and throw them in there. You can stick with the same kind of technique and build the colors up in different ways. I just had a lot of fun with the way that this one came together. I think the one that's like the outlier here was putting the knots in the skeins, which gave a larger section of resist than maybe I would have expected otherwise, but I still love the way it came out. And so even though we have more of the background color in there, we're also bringing in more of the forest green and the mauve, so I think it still works. The yarn is overwhelmingly like sort of pink, I would say, with hints of green. But our yarn mops are definitely very green with more hints of pink. And some of this could just be the way the colors spread. Some of it could be, well, the fact that the base color has a lot of pink purple in it, and that isn't as represented on these yarn mops. I do adore yarn mops like this and how different they can come out depending on how much dye is on my fingers or when and where I add acid and all that jazz. But I think that they're very pretty in a very related but different way from our main colorway. I know we had a lot of voiceovers today, but we had 5 different colorways, and any of these on their own could have been its own full video. But I adore the way that the set goes together, and the whole thing was so much fun to create. And I was so inspired by that sunrise on the marsh photo and so happy to bring this back together. And I do think I bumped up the color of the background a bit, which is something I had said that I wanted to do at the end of that dye PS video. If you love this colorway, there may be some more of it left in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. As part of this spring Miniskein mini-series, I am dyeing a lot of Miniskein sets on multiple different yarn bases, and I've either already or at some point in the near future will be adding the option to pick which night in addition to your base. So then after seeing the yarn, you can try to see, like, sort by night 2, and then see what yarn bases are available in this colorway. But in addition to all of the SMSMS yarns, the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop is filled with a lot of hand-dyed yarn featured in my videos. Now, besides my shop, there are many other ways that you can help support all of the content here. I do have a Patreon where all patrons get early access to the newest episode of Dye Pot PS each month and vote for the shape that that will take. It is the ChemKnits patrons who picked that sunrise on the march photo that inspired multiple videos I've created now. There are a lot of other perks depending on the level you pick over on Patreon. I'll link to that down in the video description, or you can just go to patreon.com/ChemKnits. But now it's time to start move forward and think about what on earth am I going to create for night 3 of the 2026 Spring Miniskein mini-series. Do you have any predictions? I know that I am so excited. Everything's going to air next week. I am so excited to hang out in the live chat and react to my videos and hang out and answer questions. And so you might be seeing me in chat right now. You never know. But I also love hearing your predictions of what might be coming up on the future nights. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.